well, there's an awful lot in the news. And I want to get into a number of other things here, if I may, just to set up possible conversations. And then after the break at the bottom of the hour, I'll start picking up your calls. I generally am not a fan of year-in-a-review shows. It seems to me like most of them are just ways to fill time. I'm not going to do that. But if there's anything about the year in review that you'd like to bring up and discuss, I have no problem with that. So just FYI. Back in 1889, there was a Native American by the name of Wovoka. He was a Paiute mystic. And in 1889, he had a vision where he said if all the tribes of North America, the Native American tribes, if all the tribes began, or if a certain threshold of the tribes began participating in the ghost dance, which was an ancient ceremony, if they began participating in the ghost dance, it would lead to, through spiritual means, it would lead to the revival of Native American communities and the white man leaving the Native Americans alone. So that was 1889. The next year, on December 29th, today, in 1890, Chief Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, led a band of 350 Minneconjou Sioux into a camp on the banks of Wounded Knee Creek. I'm reading this from Indian Country Today, by the way. Patty Jo King's piece, The Truth About the Wounded Knee Massacre, was deadly force used? Why was deadly force used at Wounded Knee? And what was going on was that these Indians were there to perform a ghost dance. But, we had said you can't do that. And the U.S. troops had surrounded them, and they were going to arrest Spotted Elk, or Bigfoot. And General Nelson Miles and Major Samuel Whiteside of the 7th Cavalry decided to stop the ghost dance. Can't have a ghost dance. So they intercepted these guys on the 28th of December, yesterday, leading to the edge of the creek, and from a hill above, and then the 29th, today, reading from this piece from Indian Country Today. From a hill above, a Hotchkiss machine gun raked the teepees. Gunsmoke filled the air, and men, women, and children ran for a ravine near the camp, only to be cut down in crossfire. More than 200 Lakota lay dead or dying in the aftermath, as well as at least 20 soldiers. For 19th century Americans, the Wounded Knee Massacre represented the end of Indian resistance and the conquest of the West. For the Indians, it represented the utter disregard of the U.S. toward its treaty responsibilities, and it represented the duplicity and cruelty of the U.S. toward Native people. That was on this day in 1890. The yield curve. I teased this twice yesterday, and I never got to it. My apologies. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, serving the 2nd District and the nation. And the piece, it's at newyorkfed.org/research/capital_markets/ycfaq.html. Anyhow, it's called the yield curve as a leading indicator. It's on the website of the New York Fed. And what the yield curve is the, expressed as a ratio, it's the relationship between the return, the yield, being paid on short-term bonds, on 3-month bonds, on 6-month bonds, or maybe even in some cases 1-year bonds, and long-term bonds, typically 10-year or 20-year Treasury bonds. Now, generally speaking, if you're tying your money up for 10 or 20 years in a long-term bond, the government would have to offer you a higher rate of return in order to tie up your money. So typically the yield on long-term bonds is higher. Say it's like 2.5% on a 10-year bond, whereas on a 5-year bond, it's only, or on a 1-year bond, it's only 1% or 1.5%, something like that. So typically there's a difference between these short-term yields and these long-term yields that represents the cost of tying up your money in a long-term bond. It just makes sense, right? It's just a very logical thing. But every now and then, the yield, that is the interest that's paid, the yield, the return that you get on short-term bonds becomes actually higher than long-term bonds, or approaches it. They're within 1/4 of a point right now. In fact, I think they're within 150 basis points, which is 0.15 of a point, right? The 1,000 basis points. Anyway, when that yield curve reverses or flattens, when those numbers come close together, or when the short-term bond yields even exceeds the long-term bond yields, that is almost all, with one exception in my lifetime, that has always meant that within the next year you're going to see a recession. The yield curve has not completely flattened, but it's in the neighborhood of where it was around 2000. And of course, there was a substantial stock market bubble that popped then.